Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
We continue the study of the book of Zechariah tonight. We're going to move into chapter 10. So let's jump right on to it. Give me Zechariah chapter 10, verse 1, please. It says, "Ask Adonai for rain in the spring, Adonai who makes the rain clouds, and he will give them showers of rain, grass in the field to each one." Now, this is actually setting us up. This is a setup. It's a comparison and contrast thing. This is actually setting us up for what's coming in the following verses. It's using the faithfulness of God to bring us blessing and provision as a point of comparison to what we could get from false gods. All right? It's using the faithfulness of God to bring us blessing and provision as a point of comparison to what we get from false gods, diviners and the like. Rain is a blessing, particularly to a society whose principal industry is agriculture. Ask Adonai for rain in the spring. He's the one who makes the rain clouds. He will give showers of rain, making grass in the fields for the flock. The point here is, if we go to God with our needs, he will give us what we need. If we go to God with our needs, he will give us what we need. Not our wants necessarily, but our needs. Now, as a comparison to God doing this, look at Zechariah 10:2, please. "For the household gods talk nonsense. The diviners have seen a lie. Their dreams convey delusions, and the comfort they offer is in vain. Therefore they go their way like sheep in distress from a lack of shepherd." In other words, they're following Satan in just so many words. This is actually setting us up for what's coming in a lot of the following verses here in chapter 10. But can we see the contrast in this from verse 1 that we read just a few minutes ago? Let's expand just a little more on this business of household gods and diviners. There's a biblical story about household gods in the life of Jacob that's a fairly major story. It gives us some insight on how controlling these household gods, these devices that people keep on their shelf to worship as false gods, and how they can be used to elevate the authority of people. They served that purpose too back in ancient times. Remember the story of how Jacob fled his brother and went to find a wife? You know, he goes to Haran for two purposes. One is to get away from Esau so Esau can cool down over the birthright thing. The one birthright thing that's still going on in Israel right now, frankly. And the second thing is because Jacob's mother really had this thing about him marrying one of the local girls where they were living, when he could go to Uncle Lavan for a bride from among his own people. I think most of us pretty well know this story. Uncle Lavan, or Laban, was not to be trusted. Jacob worked for 7 years to get Rachel as a bride and ended up with Leah. He was not to be trusted. He worked 7 more years for Rachel. Then there's the sheep thing about the herds. He's giving him so many sheep and such, and Uncle Laban had more deals going than a used car salesman. Probably just as honest as a used car salesman. He was motivated, inspired in these things by his household gods. They were of critical importance to him. And Jacob gets ready to bust out and head for home, and what transpires in this story centers around the household gods of Laban. Give me Genesis 31, please, verse 19. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, so Rachel stole the household gods that belonged to her father, and Yaakov, Jacob, outwitted Laban, the Amorite, by not telling him of his intended flight. So he fled with everything that he had. He departed, crossed the Euphrates River, and set out for the hill country of Gilead. Next. Not until the 3rd day was Laban told that Yaakov had fled. Laban took his kinsman with him and spent the next 7 days pursuing Yaakov, overtaking him in the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramite in a dream that night and said to him, "Be careful that you don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Now, without getting into a very long batch of scripture, the main reason that Laban pursued Jacob so hard is those household gods. Jacob had a 3-day head start, and Laban still ran him down. Cut through all the verbiage here. Laban admits that Jacob had a right to leave. But why did you steal my gods? Now, understand that it was Rachel, and when they went searching through everything, Rachel had him under her skirt, sitting down, said, "It's my monthly period, so I can't get up," and they left her alone. Remember all that. These household gods were so important to Laban, they were important enough for him to go into this hot pursuit of Jacob. Well, why? If we understand this, then we begin to understand the point that God is driving at in Zechariah 10:2 about household gods and diviners. Rachel was the one that stole the household gods, and the reason she stole them was the reason that Laban wanted them back. The theft was not just incidental theft, it was significant. That's why so much space is given to us in Scripture about this incident. Read all of Genesis 31 from verse 19 all the way out to verse 30 to get all the details if you want. The possession of these teraphim, the household gods, the possession of these implied leadership in the family of the clan. Whoever had those teraphim, because he had those false gods, became the leader of the family or the clan. They gave him power to rule over the clan. He was to be feared. It's somewhat like the witch doctor cults, that can be taken to the point of demonic agents being involved. When Rachel stole these teraphim, she was in her mind getting for her husband Jacob the rights over her father's property. Remember the sheep deal? Having these household gods ensured that the sheep bargained for would indeed now belong to Jacob because he had the gods. That made him in control over Laban. And this is why Laban was so determined to retrieve them, to get back his control. Genesis 31:43, please. Laban answered Jacob. This is when he's getting ready to leave and he can't win. Laban answered Yaakov, "The daughters are mine, the children are mine, the flocks are mine, and everything you see is mine. But what can I do today about these daughters of mine or the children that they have borne?" Laban was in trouble. He didn't have his false gods anymore. He didn't have his teraphim, without which he felt powerless, but the God of Jacob had also spoken to him on the way in. don't mess with Jacob. So he not only doesn't have his gods, the God of Jacob is all over him. I suspect if Laban had found and taken possession of his gods at this time, there would have been a war right then and there. The reason for getting into all this is I believe it's an important subject. I believe it has bearing on what's going on today. One of the reasons is that these teraphim are one of the instruments used by diviners, and divination is an occult imitation of biblical prophecy. Let that soak in. One of the reasons is these teraphim, these false gods, are one of the instruments used by diviners, and divination is an occult imitation of biblical prophecy. It shreds it, it cuts it, it replaces it. What Hasatan does through these false gods and divination is to imitate biblical prophecy. The implication in our story of Rachel stealing the household idols is Laban's power, his wealth, and everything he has came through those idols. Divination was and is an ungodly form of decision-making. In modern times, it sometimes takes on the form of magic or spiritualism, fortune tellers, palm readers, even astrology. We have to remember that there's a false prophet in our future in Revelation when we get there who will be a diviner who is going to cause a statue to talk. The Hebrew word for divination means to cut or to divide. So why use that particular idea to cut or divide in reference to predicting the future in order to mess with biblical prophecy? Well, to cut and divide sometimes points to how divination is done. Let's go to Ezekiel 21:21. This would be Ezekiel 21:26 in Christian Bibles, but we're looking at Ezekiel 21:21. It says, "For the king of Babylon, is standing at the fork in the road, where the two roads separate, about to use divination. He is shaking the arrows, consulting the household gods, examining the liver." Examining the liver. Well, this is just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. The word divination comes from cutting open or dividing the animal. You have to do that in order to examine its liver. That's why it's part of divination. Here, Nebuchadnezzar is at a fork in the road, wondering which way he should go and what he should do. So he's shaking the arrows, that's like reading tea leaves, consulting household gods, and examining the liver. So, what do they tell him? What he wants to hear. What he wants to hear. Zechariah 10:2 again, please. "For the household gods talk nonsense. The diviners have seen a lie. Their dreams convey delusions. And the comfort they offer is in vain. Therefore they go their way like sheep in distress for lack of a shepherd." This is just about those lacking Adonai as they set off on a journey, misdirected or lost. They suffer because they're at the hands of unscrupulous men who consult these household gods. That causes them to wander like sheep, like a flock caught in the tempest, or distress for lack of a shepherd. And who would this shepherd be that they lack because of following these false gods and doing these other things? Adonai himself. Adonai himself. They're not following Adonai, but the diviners. This is what's gotten Israel into trouble over the centuries, is they have gone off in this direction. We want to pay attention to this because of what we're getting into now. Just look at our world now, for instance. We're going to get into this subject of the condition of our world and this sort of thing in chapter 13 of Zechariah, but it appears that some of the people of Israel, not all of them, but some, will fall sway to this type of spiritualism. this type of magic. The influence of mediums will be very common as we move up onto the day of the Lord. It's becoming more and more common today. There was a report just a few years ago that said young people are flooding towards mediums and magic, sorcery, and spells. Look at the phenomenon of Harry Potter. Translated into what? 39 languages. Required reading in China. This isn't happenstance. The world is moving in that direction, and God is giving us information now that is very up to date now. This information through Zechariah is very up to date now. This is something that's happened in the past and is something that we're going to be facing as the future draws ever closer. And because of what God is giving us here, we won't be in the dark. We'll know how God will deal with it. So with that in mind, let's look at the first part of Zechariah 10:3. 10:3a, please. My anger burns towards the shepherds. Remember, the shepherds are the ones that are either not leading or they're the ones that are leading astray. God says, my anger burns against the shepherds, and I will vent it on the leaders of the flock. This continues the thought of verse 2, where God pronounces judgment on the shepherds. Look at that word for shepherd a second. The concept of shepherd is ancient, very, very ancient. There are Egyptian inscriptions dating back to 2000 BCE where shepherd becomes a symbol for a ruler in the Middle East. These inscriptions actually named a pharaoh as a herdsman. By the time of Zechariah, this would have been a very familiar figure of speech, and these shepherds were by and large false prophets, turned towards the occult, the supernatural things that were satanic, and God says that his anger burns against these leaders of the flock. And in the future, God will punish the leaders of the flock, leaders that are leading the flock to slaughter, giving them false comfort, actually leading them away from God. And for this, actually leading them away from God, they won't go unpunished. Go to Ezekiel 34:7, please. Therefore, shepherds, hear the words of Adonai. As I live, Adonai swears, because my sheep have become prey, my sheep have become food for every wild animal, since there was no shepherd, since my shepherds didn't look for my sheep. Instead, my shepherds fed themselves, but not my sheep. And boy, that gets into all things, both spiritual and physical. Therefore, shepherds, hear the word of Adonai. Adonai Elohim says, I am against the shepherds. I demand that they hand my sheep back to me. I will not allow them to feed the sheep, and they won't feed themselves either. And this last line, I will rescue my sheep from their mouths. They will be food for them no longer. They will not be able to feed on God's people. He's going to rescue his people. And that gives us a little bit of insight about what's being said in Zechariah 10:3a. God is very much aware of how these shepherds lead his flock, and they're not going to go unpunished. That's what God says there. Now, let's pick this up again in Zechariah 3 with 3b and then verse 4. It says, For Adonai Tzevaot will take care of his flock, the people of Judah. He will make them like his royal war horse. Boy, there's a lot built into that. From them come the cornerstone and tent peg. From them, the bow for battle. From them, all the rulers together. That last part of verse 3 is an assurance. The false shepherds notwithstanding, it's an assurance that God will take care of his flock. It's verse 1 restated. Note here that the flock that comes under the false shepherd is specifically stated to be Judah. Judah. Judah is a large portion of the land that is currently Israel today. Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom. Among these of Judah are those that are in submission to Adonai. See, Judah's going to be broken into two groups, those that are following the false stuff and those that are in submission to Adonai. Those in submission to Adonai will become invincible. Become invincible. We're going to discover that in Zechariah 13 when we go through that. Every time we run across a reference to the victorious remnant that possesses the land, we need to be aware that this is who is spoken of, a remnant of Judah, spoken of like a war horse in the service of God. Think of a war horse as an invincible weapon. Those that he selects out of Israel, that remnant that will become his, will be in his service like a war horse, like an invincible weapon, like a tank of World War I that was an invincible weapon of its time. Verse 4, I believe, is interesting from the point of view that some liberal commentators look at it as almost out of context, like it just doesn't fit here. But I think in view of this verse being purely messianic, it really fits quite well. Plainly states what will come out of Judah, all involving one who is coming in our future tense. All involving one who is coming in our future tense, in the future tense, who is our Messiah. These are going to be the people that are ultimately going to come out of Judah. Now, an interesting part of this is that the complete Jewish Bible uses the word them here 3 times. He says in verse 4, from them come the cornerstone and tent peg, and then he says, from them the bow for battle, see? And then again, from them all the rulers together. These are people that are going to be very important in what God does. From them come the cornerstone and the tent peg. From them come the bow and the battle. From them come all the rulers together. The Stone Edition Tanakh uses themselves. Some others use he or him. But from them, I believe, is the best translation. It's what will come out of Judah, the remnant that's being talked about here. And first thing that will come out of Judah, the remnant, is the cornerstone. If we remember the lineage of Yeshua, he's from the tribe of Judah. Now, a cornerstone is figurative for a ruler. It represents steadfast strength on which an edifice can be built. A uniting force which will unite the tribes of Israel and bring them back together permanently. That, I believe, is Yeshua, the cornerstone. What about the tent peg? Well, the tent peg is driven into the ground to hold things in place. He's going to be back on earth, not to leave again. He is going to hold everything into place. He is the tent peg, giving stability, making something otherwise vulnerable become steadfast. I think both the cornerstone and the tent peg are alluding to Messiah coming out of Judah. The bow has to do with him conquering or taking control of the world. That's the bow as in bow and arrow. And finally, all rulership will come out of him. From them, all the rulers together. This is this group of Israel that becomes the total focus of God being his war horse. When we get to Zechariah chapter 14, we're going to see that he, God, is Messiah, is going to rule all the world from Jerusalem. We've already seen this several times in previous chapters. Zechariah 10:5. This is talking about this group now that God has selected and pulled out. They will be like warriors trampling the mud of the streets in battle. They will fight because Adonai is with them. They will rout even those on horseback. They will rout even those on horseback. Still talking about this remnant of Judah, the righteous remnant of Judah. Here they're being described as mighty men, or mighty warriors of God, trampling The enemies like mire in the streets. In some translations, enemy is actually inserted. Know that the word enemies is not anywhere in the Hebrew, but understand that it is implied in the Hebrew. The thought is the enemies are waded through like mud in the streets. The last part of the verse actually carries this thought forward in the description of a triumph against overwhelming odds. The simile here is foot soldiers against cavalry. Foot soldiers against cavalry, with the foot soldiers winning. The conquest is possible because Adonai is with them, making them invincible warriors of God. And again, this is speaking of the righteous remnant of Judah. It's like when all that are around them come against them, even the world, they're going to prevail. Just that righteous remnant of Judah. Zechariah 10, 6 and 7. I will strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph. This is important. I will strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph. The house of Joseph is pointing to the northern kingdom now. I will bring them back in my compassion for them. They will be as if I hadn't driven them out. Wow. For I am Adonai their God, and I will answer them. Ephraim, men, will be like warriors. Their hearts will be cheered as if from wine. Their children will see it and rejoice. Their hearts will be glad in Adonai. See, this expands now on what we've been thinking about to this point and goes beyond the tribesmen of Judah. We haven't seen this time come quite yet, but it's on its way. Verse 6 opens with a double promise to both the house of Judah and the house of Joseph. This has meant that the southern and northern kingdoms as a whole are united together once more at the end of the age. This verb here is a composite one, meaning to return and reinstate. This is what God is going to do with all the tribes of Israel. This is absolutely what God is going to do with all the tribes of Israel. He's going to do it in his compassion for him, as he states in this passage. As we look down in verse 7, it tells us that Ephraim, who was taken away to Assyria and never returned until this day, will be returned as warriors. That will strengthen the house of Judah. Ephraim is one of the tribes of the northern kingdom. This is the saving of the house of Joseph being shown to us here through Ephraim. The northern kingdom is being taken out of the world. And again, it's those who are going to be willing to become part of the remnant that will follow Yeshua into the kingdom. Now, God says, verse 6, it will be as he had never driven them out. All will be forgiven. Not because of their good deeds, but because of the compassion God has for them. They call out, and I will answer them. That's verse 1 again. Ask Adonai for rain, and there'll be grass in the field for each one of them. In Zechariah 10:6, the thought is like there will be a prayerful call for deliverance, which is heard, and it will be answered. Some believe that this time refers to the dark period of the Great Tribulation, which ends with the second coming of Messiah. Now, I'm going to throw a theology out for you. I don't know that I agree with it, but follow it closely because you need to know it's there. There are some scholars out there that do not believe that the Israel of now, the people that are involved in the land of Israel right now, is to be the ones that are permanently in the land. Or out of them will come those that are permanently in the land. That they will be put out, all of them. And God himself will return his select to set up his kingdom. And I don't believe that's correct. See, God's select of Israel will come out from among those currently in Israel and those currently of Israel scattered around the world. It's like saying that God himself hasn't been involved in what's going on to this point, that he wasn't involved in the UN vote in 1947 that passed because Russia decided not to show up that day. Click. He wasn't involved in the war in 1948 that couldn't possibly have been won by what they had for ragtag army against all of the Arab armies that were coming against them. But the thought's out there that this nation, Israel, that's in place now, will have nothing to do with what is coming at the end of the age. See, God has to bring in the ones that he is going to have be his select ones for Messiah to rule over when he comes back. I think history has gone by. The history has gone by since 1948, showing that God has intervened so many times when Arab forces have tried to take over the land that there's not much left to support a theory that it wasn't God involved from 1947 and 48 on. But this theology is out there, and you may run into it in some form. Maybe it's a last gasp of replacement theology. I don't know. Verse 7. This verse gives special attention to Israel, to the northern kingdom. Ephraim's men will be like warriors. Their hearts will be cheered as if from wine. Their children will see it and rejoice. Their hearts will be glad in Adonai. Ephraim will be like the mighty men who not only possess strength but are also conscious of having it and delight in exercising it. Their hearts will be cheered like from wine. They're going to have it. They're going to love it. And their children are going to see it and rejoice in it. Their hearts will be glad in Adonai. They will see this and understand that this all comes from God. And let me pass on a comment. In that day, Jewish history will make sense. We've got a lot of Jewish history behind us, and a lot of it's very unpleasant, filled with pogroms, crusades, inquisitions, Holocaust. But in that day, and the day of the Lord, Jewish history will all make sense, and they will rejoice in the Lord. I don't know who to attribute that saying to, but it's there. Right now, to many people, Jewish history doesn't make sense, but this seems to be the implication here, that their children will have perfect sense made out of it. They will rejoice in Adonai. Zechariah 10:8 and 9, please. I will whistle for them and gather them, because I have redeemed them, and they will be as numerous as they were before. And I will sow them among the peoples. In distant lands they will remember me, and they will rear their children and then return. Verse 9 almost should come before verse 8 here. I will whistle for them and then gather them, because I have redeemed them. They will be as numerous as they were before. Because he will sow them from among the peoples, he will sow them from among the peoples. Now understand that they're out there because he sowed them away. Now he's going to sow them back in. I will sow them among the peoples in distant lands. They will remember me. They will rear their children and then return. Some English translation says, I will signal for them instead of whistle for them. The Hebrew word here is like making a sound to get someone's attention, so whistle works. Now, obviously to us this has not been fulfilled because of the statement in verse 9. They will rear their children and then return. See, the exile will not be over until many generations have passed. They will rear their children and then return. The exile has lasted a long, long time. The return has only partially happened at this point with what we have going on in the current nation of Israel. There are still more Jews, more Israelis, outside of Israel than living there. It was estimated that 12 million lived in the land prior to the destruction of the second temple. And that would have only involved the tribe of Judah, because Israel was never brought back during the time of the second temple. There are now currently only 6.6, give or take, million people in the land, Jews and Israelis, because we're getting a lot of the other tribes returning. Have you noticed that one of the things in the U.S.-sponsored peace initiative is there should be no more settlers in Yeshua? Yeshua is the area around Jerusalem. If we're going to have peace, we can't let any more people back into the West Bank. We can't let this happen if we're going to have peace. I think that's extraordinary. I think that's from Satan. You see, it's Satan that doesn't want any more building, any more expansion into what are the historic lands of Israel because of this prophecy, because the continuing expansion of settlements is needed to accommodate the flow of Israel back into the land to fulfill this prophecy as God continues to bring his people back. So understand, this is going to happen. It's going to happen. We're going to get more people. Verse 9 says, I sow the people out of the land. Man says God cast the people out of the land in 70 CE, but God says, I sowed them out. This corresponds to Hosea chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, please. Hosea, by the way, is a variation from the same root as Yeshua, so this is a picture based on something of Yeshua. So Hoshea, went and married Gomer, the son of Divlaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Now this gets very interesting in wordplay. And Adonai said to him, call him Yisrael, because in only a short time I will punish the house of Jehu for having shed blood at Yisrael. I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. When that day comes, I will break the bow of Israel in the Yisrael valley. Boy, Yisrael gets to be a busy word there, doesn't it? A lot of wordplay. Yisrael here is an agricultural term for planting. Let's begin with that thought. Israel here is an agricultural term for planting done by throwing or sowing your seed away from you. I can remember walking through pasture with my grandfather where he had a cedar that he could cast seed away from him as he was casting clover into the pasture. By throwing or sowing your seed out away from you is how he got rid of his people that were cluttering up his land. Israel is also the valley, Jezreel Valley in the English. And the son is named Yisrael because in a short time God is going to sow Yisrael away from him. Did you get the difference? Yisrael is the son named because in a short time God is going to sow Yisrael away from him. He's going to cast them out of the land, sow them out of the land. God has planted his people outside of the land. There's got to be very few, and if any, very tiny nations on earth, if again any, that don't have some kind of a Jewish population today. Zechariah 10:8 said, in distant lands they will remember me. I won't get into that tonight, but I think what in distant lands they will remember me alludes to is revival. Revival being remembering God. There's a coming flood of Israel back into the land, all the tribes, and I think that will include significant numbers of believing Jews. If you look at it, there were less than 100 known believing Jews in Israel in 1948. Today there are over 30,000. Over 30,000. They will make up the faithful remnant that is left to reclaim the land. God sowed Israel throughout the whole earth. In reality, it was God himself that did this. Men doing the scattering were mere instruments in God's hands. Zechariah 10:10. I will bring them back from the land of Egypt and gather them out of Asher. I will bring them into Gilead and to Levan, that's Lebanon. until there is no more room for them. In other words, he's going to fill it up with us. Trouble will pass over the sea and stir up waves in the sea. All the depths of the Nile will be dried up. The pride of Asher will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will leave. Keep Asher and Egypt as separate thoughts. He's going to bring them back from the land of Egypt and gather them out of Asher. Egypt to the west, Asher to the east. Asher will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will leave. We're going to explore a lot of this. We need to understand that Egypt and Asher is Assyria in most of your Bibles. We need to understand that Egypt and Asher generally symbolizes the nations, the Goyim, the Gentiles. The reference to Egypt here would bring to mind the kind of miraculous delivery from power and military forces like the one that Moses led, if you will. That's what the celebration of Passover is all about. Asher historically refers to a great empire whose capital was in Nineveh. It's up to the east of Jerusalem. That empire extends all the way back to the 3rd millennium BCE. But in the Old Testament, Asher, or Assyria, is not always referred to as this huge empire alone. It has other references other than it being this first huge empire. Often, the term Asher is used to represent the powers that one after another took place down through history to the north and the east of Israel. It can refer to an existing world power at the time of the event that we're going to have at the end of the age. In other words, it can mean a world empire that's being created now. And it doesn't have to have any real reference other than what's going on currently to the original empire. So this is talking about calling the people of Israel back from among the nations, from a world empire of that particular time, miraculously done in the face of overwhelming power and military might. That, of course, we'll see prophetically as we go further into this study series. Then it says, I will bring them into Gilead, and Lebanon. Now, Gilead, what makes up Gilead, are of these nations today. Gilead is the entire region east of the Jordan River, once occupied by Israel. See, Gilead and Lebanon are in part what made up the final Israel, or will make up the final Israel as promised to Abraham. And Gilead is the entire region east of the Jordan, once occupied by Israel, occupied by Reuben, by Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh at the time of entry under Joshua. Remember, these tribes asked if they could stay over on the east side of the Jordan. Most of modern Jordan today is included in this, except for the very south and eastern fringe that's in the desert of Arabia. Also, the Golan Heights and much of southwestern Syria make up what is known here as Gilead. The Lebanon here includes most of modern-day Lebanon and what we know today as Lebanon, but a bit more. A bit more. This is where God says he is going to bring those people that he returns to Israel. The war with Edom in Obadiah supports this territory coming into the possession of Israel during that war that's described in Obadiah. Gilead is mentioned there by name. Even this increased amount of territory, though, it tells us it's going to be filled up. We're talking about a huge return of God's people. Primarily, we're talking about a huge return of God's people, Israel, maybe a third of those in the world finding Messiah. As all this comes to a screeching halt and it becomes obvious what's going on to them. Go to Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 7 and 8, please. when people no longer swear as Adonai lives, who brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as Adonai lives, who brought the descendants of the house of Israel up from the land of the north and from all the countries where I drove them. Then they will live in their own land. This means more than just the Russian return that we often hear applied to this particular passage. This is going to be from everywhere, all of the countries where I have driven my people. He's going to return them. Then they will live in their own land. Back to Jeremiah 10 and 11, please. I will bring them back from the land of Egypt and gather them out of Ashur. I will bring them into Gilead and Lebanon until there's no more room for them. Trouble will pass over the sea and stir up waves in the sea. All the depths of the Nile will be dried up. The pride of Ashur will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will live. Verse 11 is a problem. It says, trouble will pass over the sea and stir up the waves of the sea. The problem is that the complete Jewish Bible ignores the fact that in the Hebrew there is the pronoun he leading this last verse 7. The complete Jewish Bible ignores the fact that in the Hebrew there is the pronoun he that leads this verse 7. That he, a direct reference to Adonai God, Yeshua perhaps, who is bringing these people back. Many others also have dropped, many other translations have also dropped the use of he. We might expect the Stone Edition Tanakh and the JPS Tanakh wouldn't bother to include he, which would be pointing to an action of Messiah. But neither does the New English Bible translation, for instance, a modern translation. The NIV and the Living Bible do include a pronoun, but they use they instead of he. This is probably in an attempt to make this verse compatible with Ephraim, up in verse 7, where Ephraim is in the plural, about Ephraim's men becoming warriors. But I don't think this is speaking of Ephraim. The Hebrew uses he. They becomes a stretch. What have we been talking about since verse 8? What we've been talking about since verse 8 is what God is doing. He says, I will sow. I will whistle. He's going to sow them out of the land. I will bring them back. I will gather them. I will bring them into my presence in the land. Now look at how the King James Version reads this. Remember, this says trouble will pass over the sea. Look at how the King James Version words this. It says, and he shall pass through the sea with affliction and shall smite the waves in the sea, and all the deeps of the river shall dry up. He, God. This tells us that he will be at the head of his people, like when he led the people through the Dead Sea, with Pharaoh right behind. The scepter refers to the ruling authority of Egypt, pointing to the nations. Egypt is pointing to the nations always. The scepter refers to the ruling authority of the nations. Sort of like when the sea closed in over Pharaoh and his army. The scepter of Egypt shall depart. The scepter of the world is going to be done away with. I think it's going to be with the same kind of authority that God brought Israel out of Egypt under Moses that this happens. Not a duplicate event, but with the same authority. That's with his people behind him, and he shall smite the waves of the sea. When God steps in, it will be the end of the authority of the nations over his people. The affliction of his people will end. The nations will be put to shame. The implication here with the removal of the scepter is that the nations will cease to have independent governments. They will come under the authority of God and his Messiah when Messiah takes over to rule. The nations of the earth will be subdued. The governments will be subject to the rule of Messiah from Jerusalem for the millennium. Just think what's happening here. There are going to be world governments, but subject to Messiah in Jerusalem. We'll see the order of this really when we get to Zechariah 14. Remember how Satan tries to imitate prophecy? Well, that's what globalism today is all about. Satan trying to imitate prophecy. They're trying to set up a worldwide political system, even though nations will still govern themselves. They will be subject to this world political system and ultimately to a false Messiah who will set up shop in Jerusalem. A counterfeit of what God ultimately plans to bring, which will replace it. But first, Satan will try to do this with himself as the deity behind it all. So you see then why the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and Israel are so important. It all boils down to a war between the God of Islam and the God of Israel as to who will control the land, the city, and who will be worshipped on the Temple Mount. This is not going to go away. Quite honestly, this is going to explode. This is going to explode. Globalism is Satan's imitation of what God's doing, or going to do, in bringing Messiah to rule. Just like divination is Satan's imitation of God's prophecy. And that is what's going on right now. There are treaties, I understand, some of which haven't been signed, that are probably going to affect our personal lives on a day-to-day basis. Zechariah 10:12, please. But I will strengthen Israel in Adonai, and they will travel here and there in his name, says Adonai. The Amplified Old Testament translates it this way. I will strengthen Israel in the Lord, and they shall walk up and down and glory in his name, says the Lord. I think that translates that passage real well. The whole package, the whole book of Zechariah is in poetic form. This particular verse is in ABBA. A, I will strengthen Israel. B, in Adonai. B, in his name. A, they will travel here to there in his name. This is restated for us in Isaiah 40:31, please. But those who hope in Adonai will renew their strength. They will soar aloft as with eagle's wings. When they are running, they won't grow weary. When they are walking, they won't get tired. We got a couple of minutes left, so I want to go back and look at this Gilead and Lebanon thing in verse 10 some more, real quickly. Most people don't have a clue what God is saying that Israel is going to grow into. Most people really have no concept of this. Here God is saying that Israel will encompass, that is, fill up Gilead and Lebanon at some point in our future. As we mentioned, this includes major portions of modern-day Jordan and Lebanon, plus a part of Syria up to the Euphrates. That's land that's going to be taken away from the false that are after replacing what God wants. What the world really doesn't want to hear is that Israel will probably acquire this territory as the spoils of war. There's going to be a huge war. Go to Psalm 83, 5 through 9, please. With one mind they plot their schemes. That's the adversaries. The covenant they have made is against you. The tents of Edom and the Lishmaim, that's Ishmael. Moab and the Hagrim. Gaval, Ammon, and Amalek, Pleshet, with those living in Zor. Asher, too, is allied with them to reinforce the descendants of Lot. Do to them as you did to Midian, to Sisera, and Yavin at Vadi Kishon. If we're not aware of this, we need to know it. What we just read is an alliance of nations given by their ancient names That alliance has never occurred in history until now. That alliance has never occurred in history to now. Edom and Ishmael are the modern Arabs. Their countries are made up of these ancient lands. Moab, Hagrim, Gaval, Ammon, and Amalek, all to the east of Israel. Plashet are the Philistines in Gaza. Zor is Lebanon. Asher is up across Syria. All of the area listed in Zechariah 10:10 as places where God is going to return his people Israel to are represented somewhere in this alliance. And it's the first time this alliance has ever occurred in history where these have all come together. And that alliance is going to come against Israel to try to wipe them out as a nation, yet God says that he will return Israel to those places. We need to keep that in mind. We know who wins. Look then finally at Psalm 83, 10 through 13. They were destroyed in Endor and became manure for the ground. Make their leaders like Oreb and Zeev, and all their princes like Zevach and Zalmunna, who said, let's take possession of God's meadows for ourselves. See, that's their goal. But they're going to end up like manure on the ground. And then verse 13 is a plea. My God, make them like whirling dust, like chaff driven by the wind. See, that's what they want. Possess God's meadows, his temple mount, to worship their false deity. And I believe that Adonai is going to make them like whirling dust and chaff driven by the wind in response. We win. We'll close with that.